So the 1890s is a period of change not only in nationwide politics, but also in population in the United States. Starting with 1890, we see a distinct shift in the people coming to the United States. They're very different demographically than the immigrants we saw coming to the United States before. In the decade of the 1890s alone, we have about 3.5 million people immigrating to the United States, increasingly from Southern and Eastern Europe, from places like Italy, Greece, Russia, Ukraine, Poland. And not everybody is happy about this demographic shift because a lot of these immigrants were Catholic or Jewish, and this made a lot of white Protestant Americans very upset because they felt threatened by potential demographic change, that these new people coming in, they called them beaten men from beaten races, would alter American society for the worse. If this sounds familiar, this is a constant complaint about immigration throughout American history. The only thing that really changes is which group of immigrants we're complaining about. But you can find similar anti immigrant arguments even back to before the United States becomes its own independent nation. So this is a constant throughout American history. So many people were afraid that these new immigrants would change America for the worse. And so we see a rise of what we call nativism. Nativism is this fear of foreigners, what we call xenophobia, but also this desire to promote those that they see as native born. So there's this desire to sort of protect the United States from these, what they see as invading immigrants, and to protect what they see as sort of current American values, defined largely by white and Protestant culture. And so, sorry about that. My dogs have decided to bark at something. So, how do you protect Native American, or I mean, Native culture, not Native American as in indigenous, but Native white culture? How do you protect it from immigrants? Groups like the Immigration Restriction League in Boston, which was founded in 1894, wanted to restrict immigration by putting requirements in place. For example, that immigrants had to pass literacy tests to be able to enter the United States to prove that they could read and write. There's also moves to restrict immigrants from both getting citizenship and, if once they did become citizens, from exercising rights, including voting. For example, the 1890s is the period in time in which the United States formally adopts secret or Australian style ballots, which was meant to limit the ability of immigrants from voting because they're not allowed to bring in somebody from the outside to maybe interpret the English language ballot for them. Literacy tests continue to be a popular proposal among nativists, and also making it harder to get citizenship were all things that were proposed to protect the United States from the negative influence of these immigrants. But immigrants keep coming because of a lot of different reasons. Traditionally, when we talk about immigration history and we talk about the reason why people migrate, there's push factors and there's pull factors. So push factors are factors that propel somebody to leave their homeland. So things like war, famine, religious violence, political persecution, lack of economic opportunities. Those are all reasons that might drive somebody out of their homeland. When we talk about pull factors, these are things that are attracting them to go to a certain place. So for the United States, the biggest pull factor is the economy. The United States economy is in good shape. Many immigrants are moving to the United States for economic opportunities. They're looking for work. But there's also a sizable number of immigrants, particularly Jewish immigrants, who are looking for freedom from religious persecution because during this time period in Eastern Europe, there's a series of systematic campaigns of violence called pogroms carried out against the Jewish population in Eastern Europe. There's also a desire among certain people, again, a lot of them in Southern and Eastern Europe, for more political freedom. So there are a lot of reasons why the United States is desirable to these immigrants who come over. And a lot of immigrants coming over in the 1890s ended up working in factories in urban areas. Nativists in the United States start targeting certain groups that they see as undesirable to immigrate and pass laws to restrict them from immigrating at all. In 1875, Congress passes laws to prohibit prostitutes and felons from entering the United States. Now, the felon thing would be easier to check. The prostitute thing, usually that was just kind of subject to their own opinion, unless they actively caught somebody in the act of prostitution. In 1882, there was also a move to ban people identified as lunatics, or in other words, who had mental health issues, and also those likely to be a burden on society. So, in other words, people who were very poor or who had limited ability to work for and support themselves, those would be people who would be rejected as well. There's also a limit to ban people with undesirable political opinions, particularly anarchists, right, who advocate for no government whatsoever. But the first group of people systematically to be denied access on the basis of their national identity in the United States are the Chinese. So the Chinese in the United States had been coming over for decades at this point. Between 1850 and 1870, most of the people coming to the United States from China are men coming over as laborers, whether either freely or through indentured contracts in which many of them were tricked into signing these very terrible labor contracts that made them essentially no different from slaves. After 1870, we start to see a shift in the pattern of immigration from China, and now we're looking at entire families coming over to the United States. And when the population shifts from these Chinese men being brought in to work in mining and railroad construction and agriculture to now entire families, this starts to raise alarm bells with nativists, because now they're afraid if we have families, that means population growth. We're going to have more Chinese people because now we have entire families. So there's a move to target Chinese women and try to prevent them from coming into the United States. The Page Law in 1875 was ostensibly meant to curb prostitution, but in reality prohibited the immigration of Chinese women, on the argument that they were trying to protect these women from sex trafficking, even if it was very clear they were trying to come over with their families. And then eventually, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which completely cuts off Chinese immigration. And this is renewed every year until it is made more permanent in 1902. At the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first time the United States had ever banned a group of people strictly based on their nationality, there were about 105,000 people of Chinese descent in the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act bans more people from coming to China, but it does not say anything about the Chinese people already here. So the question becomes, what happens to people of Chinese descent who are still in the United States? What civil rights do they have? The California Supreme Court in 1885, in the case of Tate v. Hurley, recognized that Chinese students should have a right to attend public schools, because previously the state of California had tried to ban Chinese students from attending schools. However, California decides at this point that they're going to end up segregating these students. So what ends up happening in California is we have these segregated schools that are for white kids, Asian kids, black kids, Hispanic kids, etc. So a little bit more complicated system of school segregation than we see later on in the South with Jim Crow. And that system of segregated public schools will not be fixed until 1947. There are other cases that are good for Chinese American rights. For example, Yik Wo v. Hopkins was a victory in 1886 that recognized the ability of Chinese laundries to gain official licenses and be regulated businesses by the state, which had tried to ban these economic enterprises. And in the United States versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed that people of Chinese descent born in the United States were citizens according to the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship status. However, for those who were still immigrants who were not born in the United States, the case of Fong Yu Tin in 1893 ruled that Chinese immigrants could be deported without due process. And this ruling is going to be devastating not only for Chinese immigrants, but also for other immigrant groups that are dubbed undesirable. So, this idea of deporting immigrants without due process, by which you mean without a hearing, without an investigation, just literally tossing them on the ship back to where they came from without any kind of formal review, this is a pretty damaging finding in U.S. history, and particularly an example of the victory of nativism against these new immigrants.